Good morning, Julia.
Thanks so much for joining us. There's lots to talk about, but I do want to start with the European Court of Human Rights and this absolutely absurd judgment that was made yesterday in the case of a bunch of elderly Swiss women. I say elderly, but in their 70s. And they've claimed that because of their age, they're more at risk of dying in a heat wave, and therefore their human rights have been impacted by the Swiss government's complete failure, they say, to actually tackle climate change and to stick to their net zero pledges and cut carbon emissions, and that therefore the Swiss government must act to protect their human rights. I mean, possibly the biggest expansion ever. And my God, we've seen a lot of expansions of the jurisdiction of this court. What do you make of that ruling, and what should we do about it?
Well, it is absurd, as you've already indicated, Julia. You can't have a human rights court adjudicating on matters of government policy, which effectively is what they've done. You know, our response to this notional man-made climate change that's taking place. And it's worth noting that Switzerland produces less than 0.1% of global carbon emissions.
As do we.
Utterly absurd. I think we do less than 1%. Then they're 1/10.
That's only because we closed down all our industry. I'd be proud if we were producing more.
Anyway, but the real point here is that you've got a court which has 18 conventions which guide it, and it can interpret those conventions in any which way it likes. It doesn't enforce the law that's made by legislature in a democratic way. It's a bunch of guys sitting, or bunch of girls and guys sitting in a room deciding how the convention should be applied.
Yeah. And they're not even judges. These people aren't even people with, they're not vast, brilliant legal minds even.
No, well, clearly not. And once they make these laws, once they adjudicate, they effectively make law, particularly in the case of the United Kingdom, because Tony Blair, in all his wisdom, elevated the European Court of Human Rights to the supreme, being the supreme judicial body in the United Kingdom for such issues, above the Supreme Court. Yeah. So even though this is a Swiss case and has nothing to do with the United Kingdom, we will now find in our country that we will have to take note of the European Court's ruling. Yeah. It is an affront to democracy, actually, Julia, is what's taking place here.
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely is. But the only solution to this, you know and I know, is to leave the European Court of Human Rights, something that Rishi Sunak has sort of vaguely in an interview of The Sun the other week, might be something that he would consider putting into the manifesto if they get, but they're not going to get elected. So, but half of Tory voters in the latest poll have suggested that they want to leave the European Court of Human Rights, and that's just relating to Rwanda policy, which it's believed that the European Court will have an impact and stop even if we ever get everything through the courts, through Parliament here, that we're actually going to ever see any flights take off. And even if we do, future ones will be stopped. Who are we kidding? It's not going to make a difference to anything. But it does really just feel like there is now a groundswell of opinion among a lot of voters that we need to stop allowing, not just the courts, but foreign courts from having a say over the day-to-day running of our government.
Well, actually, it's a breach of their own mandate, because the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 21, requires that people are governed through a democratic process. And if you have a foreign court, which is not accountable to the British people, making laws on the hoof, that fundamentally undermines democracy. And of course, we see this right across the political landscape. We've seen it since Tony Blair came to office, David Cameron, Theresa May, and indeed Boris Johnson and Sunak after him, in creating and empowering quangos and supranational institutions, taking power away from the legislature in the United Kingdom and giving it to people who are not accountable to the people of this country. Yeah. That is anti-democratic. Yeah. And we've had our democracy assaulted on all fronts for many, many years now. And you're absolutely right. We've got to leave the convention, or at the very least, remove the court from having any jurisdiction in the United Kingdom.
And again, which we can easily do. And again, we're allowed to change the law on that. And this is the idea that we won't have any human rights in this country if we don't have this court. And it was only the Europe that gave us human rights. I hate to tell you, guys and girls, we're the ones who delivered the human rights to most of Europe. You're welcome, is what we should be saying to them. Let's also talk about Rwanda again. I mean, I only want, I only want the policy to get off the ground now or be killed off completely, just so I don't have to keep talking about it, because I still don't think it's going to change anything about the number of channel migrants we have. But Rishi Sunak has said yet again he does expect Rwanda flights to take off from spring, despite the fact we've now learned that vast amount of the local housing supposedly going to be given to those migrants being sent to Rwanda has actually been sold off to local Rwandans. I mean, and apparently they were already on estate agent websites when Suella Braverman, when she was Home Secretary, visited Rwanda. What do you make
I mean,
of
the
that?
whole Rwanda thing is a waste of time, Julia. We've wasted money on it. We've wasted time on it on air. The whole thing is a distraction. Even if, as you say, flights take off, it's not going to be any deterrent whatsoever to people seeking to cross the channel. They've faced much bigger risks and much bigger hardship in order to make that journey to the UK. And they have the big carrot of £50,000 a year being spent on them once they get here. No way is Rwanda ever going to work. I call it performative government policy or performative legislation. It's fundamentally designed to distract us from the core issue, which is that the boats need to be stopped in the channel physically by border force. The reason border force is called border force is because they're meant to use force at the border. But we've forgotten what that means.
That's a very fair point, actually. It is extraordinary. Also, latest stats from the Home Office, and this extraordinary in relation to, as we've seen again and again, cases where people have been allowed to stay in this country who are criminals and then have gone on to commit horrific crimes, including that awful alkali attack on a mother and her children in Clapham. But the Home Office asylum decisions, we learned, are being overturned by more than half of applicants. This, as they revealed, reveals that a convicted sex offender was awarded refugee status after a judge ruled he'd be at risk of mob violence in Afghanistan. So basically, even though he was convicted of outraging public decency and exposure in 2017, placed on the sex offenders register, he was allowed to remain here because he could be at risk of violence in Afghanistan. It's like, I don't want any to be at risk of violence in Afghanistan, but I'm not sure why it has to be our women's problem when he was a risk to women. Now, given that half of decisions by the Home Office on asylum are overturned on appeal, does that suggest that those decisions are wrong? Or does that suggest that the appeals process is run by a load of bleeding hearters?
Well, we have a system that is tilted completely in favour of those who are seeking asylum, no matter how it is that they got to the United Kingdom. One of the great things that Suella Braverman tried to do, which she failed to achieve, but which she tried, was to make it impossible for anyone who entered the country illegally to apply for asylum. Remember, that was the point of the illegal migrant, or one of the key points of the illegal migration bill, which then became the Act. But by the time it became an Act, they'd removed that crucial bit of legislation. So, that legislation is not there on the statute books where it should be.
So what was the point of it?
So you've got a system which has been hijacked by bleeding heart liberals. That's what we've got. The asylum system is hijacked, Julia. There's no real adjudication taking place on people's merits. They can find any old excuse to stay in the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. Just finally, no doubt at all, you're Deputy Leader of Reform UK, doing very well in the polls, riding up consistently week by week, different polling companies seeing your poll ratings going up, doing better than the Tories in some polls in the north of the country and among men. Realistically, though, as well as you can do in these polls, when it comes to the local elections, in terms of the number of candidates you're standing, when it comes to the general election, likely October, November this year, in terms of the candidates you stand, you could well end up without a single MP, or maybe a couple, and have no impact. Would Reform UK have more impact doing a deal with the Tories than remaining as their sort of bête noire in the polls?
Yeah, there will be no deals with the Conservative Party. When I joined Reform UK, there will be no deals with the Conservative Party. I have it in writing from Richard Tice, a solemn promise, which was the basis on which I joined Reform UK, that we will do no deals with them. The Conservative Parliamentary Party deserves to be obliterated, and obliterated it shall be. And unless and until they discover what conservatism means, they have no truck with the name. They have no right to the name Conservative Party. Okay. So that answers the first bit of it. The second bit is that the political wind is in our sails. As the polls go at the moment, we may not get any seats. But if we break through the magic 20% barrier, we will get seats.
Okay.
And for every percent above 20%, we'll get disproportionately greater numbers of seats. So we aim to get seats in the general election.
Okay, well, there's strong words from Ben Habib. I'm so glad we got you back on the line. Ben Habib there, Deputy Leader of Reform.